If he didn't act now, Lucas might miss the narrow door that opens only once in a boy's life. The winter formal was 3 days away, the gym already strung with white lights and paper snowflakes, and Emily, his quiet crush since 5th grade youth group, stood at her locker after choir, laughing with her friends. He rehearsed his words, palms damp inside thrift store gloves, heart rattling like a train on old rails. He told her the truth. He liked her, he respected her, and he hoped she would go to the dance with him. Emily's smile was kind, which somehow made it hurt more. "I'm staying single this year," she said softly. "I'm going with the girls." She touched his sleeve in a small gesture of apology and turned to gather her things. Her friends tried to talk about homework, as if the hallway hadn't just shifted under his feet. Lucas reached the parking lot with his dignity barely stitched together. Cold air burned his throat. He climbed into the dented sedan and watched his breath fog the windshield until everything blurred. It wasn't the first time he had tasted humiliation, but it was the sharpest. An old voice stirred and started its chant. "You're the last pick. You're the throwaway. You're nothing." 2 days later, he told his mother he wasn't going. She pressed the hanger into his hands anyway, the second-hand suit she had spent 2 weekends altering. "You'll regret it if you hide," she said. "Go, stand tall, even if your knees shake." So he went, late, planning to slip in, find the chess club table, and survive the night by sheer stubbornness. The doors opened. Heat and music rolled over him. A laugh he knew by heart rose above the beat. He turned. The sight hit like a body blow. Emily under the lights, not with a circle of girls, but hand in hand with Noah, his former best friend, the one who had stopped returning texts after making varsity and discovering shinier companions. No promises had been made, yet the alignment of faces and timing stung like betrayal. He wanted to collapse into a puddle of tears, to disappear between bleachers, to be anywhere but there. He didn't cry. The tears swelled, then retreated like a tide that chose not to flood. He left the gym, stepped into the January night, and walked without plan. Ice crackled beneath his shoes. Above, the sky was enamel black, pinpricked with distant fires. Behind the baseball field, the town water tower rose like a giant's drum. He sat on the hill, fists jammed in his pockets, breath streaming like smoke. Something stubborn stirred, a spark that hated the story he was living. He stood and jogged a slow lap around the track, then faster, until the cold bit his lungs and the world narrowed to breath and motion. The next morning he added push-ups beside his bed. The day after, he borrowed a barbell from his uncle's garage. By week's end, he had a library card and came home with books on speaking clearly, listening well, building habits, starting from nothing, and the surprising power of steady, thankless work. He added prayer, not the polished kind, but halting words in the dark, asking God to do something with him besides let him drift. At first, the changes were private. He lifted while the house slept, ran before sunrise, underlined sentences in thrifted paperbacks, learned to shake hands firmly, to look people in the eye, to listen before answering. He saved what little he earned stocking shelves at the hardware store, and when spring came, he bought a battered mower and started a weekend route. By summer, he had 2 middle schoolers on payroll to edge lawns and sweep clippings while he scheduled jobs and learned spreadsheets the way other people memorized box scores. He practiced speaking without bragging, confidence without cruelty, courage without theatrics. The town felt bigger and smaller at once. Bigger because he had stepped into its stream. Smaller because he wasn't drifting anymore. He spoke with retirees and young couples and a widower who told stories from his years on the Iron Range. He learned that honest service sells itself. He asked mentors to coffee and arrived with questions and a notebook. He failed often, misquoted a job, broke a trimmer head, double-booked a Saturday, then wrote down what not to repeat. Then August tore a seam he couldn't patch. His dad's job disappeared in a merger. Bills gathered like storm clouds. His parents whispered in the kitchen, trying to turn worry into plans. Lucas stared at his margins and realized his weekend business could remain a boy's experiment or become a bridge. He chose the bridge. He postponed the out-of-state dream, enrolled at the community college downriver, and scaled the company with used gear and disciplined hours. The work was ungentle, but it was honest and it steadied the house. Other tremors followed. A classmate overdosed. The youth group rallied, cooked casseroles, prayed through the night, and learned again how thin life is. A windstorm ripped shingles from the roof. Lucas spent a Saturday on a ladder with a borrowed nail gun, praying over every strip of tar. The pastor who had baptized him resigned, confessing exhaustion and doubt. The church wept without scandal. and learned that shepherds are sheep too. Each event tugged at his certainties, then set them down nearer to solid ground. One more blow arrived on the first snow of November. The hardware store cut hours, and with them went the safe, predictable paycheck that had helped float his early equipment payments. For a full hour, he considered quitting the classes, selling the mowers, and folding back into the quiet of disappointed boys. Instead, he printed flyers, knocked on doors, and pitched winter services, leaf collection, gutter clears, driveway shoveling at dawn. He offered a discount to retirees and a guarantee he would never miss a storm. By the second snowfall, he had a route and a reason to wake up at 4:30. One evening, he stood on the bluff outside town where the glacier-carved valley poured into distance and the interstate braided like silver ropes. The sun was a coin balanced on the lip of the world. In the fading light, the ridgelines stacked like steps. He thought, becoming a man of God is like climbing that. You don't fly, you don't ride, you hike and the mountain will not flatter you. He didn't yet know the names of the outposts ahead, but he understood where the trail must begin. At the foothills of that mountain, he placed a marker in his heart with a single word: humility. Lucas didn't wake up one morning suddenly humble. Pride doesn't die with a single strike. It fades by inches, fought every day like weeds between the stones. After his small business took root, people in town started to notice him, not as the awkward kid from the winter formal, but as the young man who worked hard, showed up early, and kept his word. Compliments began to come as easily as air. Each one tested him more than criticism ever had. One evening, after finishing a late job, Lucas stopped by the diner for pie and coffee. Two classmates from college waved him over. They talked about grades, future plans, and the struggle of finding purpose. Then one of them said, half joking, "Man, you're killing it. I wish I had your discipline." Lucas smiled but felt something shift inside, a quiet, hungry whisper saying, "Yes, you are killing it. You deserve the praise." He laughed it off, but the voice lingered on his drive home, murmuring through the dashboard light. He didn't like that voice. It reminded him of the night outside the gym, the night he promised himself never to feel small again. Pride had disguised itself as healing, whispering, "Be strong, be admired, never be humiliated again." He prayed that night not for success but for sight, to see himself truthfully, stripped of reputation. Days later, his prayer was answered in a way he hadn't expected. On a rainy Saturday, while hauling mulch to a client's backyard, he misjudged a slope and cracked the tailgate of his truck. The sound was sharp, final, like a verdict. The repair cost would eat half his savings. The client, a retired carpenter, came out with a tarp and helped him cover the load. "Accidents happen," the old man said. "The question is whether you let them teach you." Lucas drove home in silence. That night, he read the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. The Pharisee thanked God for making him better than others. The tax collector simply beat his chest and said, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." He saw himself in both men, striving to be righteous, yet secretly hungry for admiration. Tears finally came, washing years of silent competition from his heart. Humility didn't make him passive. It sharpened him. He realized that to climb higher, he had to bend lower. Not in defeat, but in reverence. He began volunteering at the community shelter on weekends, stacking cans, cleaning floors, talking with veterans who slept in the cold. One man, Peter, a weathered Marine with trembling hands, told him, "I used to think humility was weakness. Turns out it's the only thing that made me human again." That sentence tattooed itself onto Lucas's mind. In humility, he discovered a new strength, the ability to listen without judgment, to serve without spotlight, to lose without bitterness. When a competitor underbid him and took a major client, Lucas congratulated him instead of cursing. The old Lucas would have sworn vengeance. The new one understood that no blessing could be stolen if God had not assigned it to begin with. Winter came hard that year. Snow muffled the streets and his mornings began in darkness. He shoveled driveways before dawn, hands cracked and bleeding, breath freezing in clouds. He remembered the night of the school dance, how humiliation had driven him toward self-improvement. Now humility drove him toward surrender. He wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. He just wanted to honor God in small things, in how he spoke, worked, and treated others. One Sunday morning, his pastor preached about Moses, how a man raised in a palace became a shepherd for 40 years before God called him back to Egypt, how humility prepared him for greatness. When we're emptied of pride, the pastor said, God can fill us with purpose. Lucas wrote it down, underlining it twice. He didn't know it yet, but the next chapter of his life would demand more than humility. It would demand strength, the kind that doesn't come from muscle but from grace. A month later, the test arrived. His mother was diagnosed with early-stage cancer. The word fell like an iron bell. Treatments would be expensive, schedules unpredictable. Lucas canceled expansion plans, scaled back contracts, and drove her to every appointment. In waiting rooms, surrounded by silence and antiseptic air, he read psalms aloud, holding her hand as if his voice could steady her heartbeat. She smiled through the pain and whispered, "You've grown into a good man, Lucas. Don't let fear undo what God has built." He tried to be brave, but fear crawled under his skin. Nights became battlegrounds of what-ifs. One dawn, after another sleepless vigil, he went out to the hill behind the house where frost coated the grass like glass. He dropped to his knees, too tired to form words, and let his tears speak for him. The sunrise spilled over the horizon, lighting the field like gold dust. In that fragile stillness, he felt a whisper, not from within but from beyond, saying, "My power is made perfect in weakness." He had read those words before, from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Now they weren't ink on paper. They were life itself. Strength, he realized, begins where self-sufficiency ends. That morning marked the next stage of his climb. The outpost of humility had been conquered not by effort, but by surrender. Ahead lay the next ascent, strength, the spiritual kind forged in weakness and trust. Before leaving the hill, Lucas looked down at the town waking below, smoke curling from chimneys, cars flashing in the distance. Somewhere in that ordinary world, battles of pride and faith were raging inside every heart. He whispered, "Teach me, Lord, how to fight the right wars." The mountain waited, and he took his first step toward the second outpost, strength. Strength was not what Lucas imagined. He had pictured roaring victories, iron will, and triumph over hardship. But true strength, he soon learned, grew quietly, like roots spreading unseen beneath a frozen ground. After his mother's diagnosis, every day became a small test of endurance. He worked longer hours to cover bills, studied late into the night, and still found time to cook, clean, and pray with her. The weight never lifted, but something inside him began to solidify, not hardness, but steadiness. One bitter February morning, the truck wouldn't start. His hands were numb, the driveway slick with ice, and he had 3 jobs lined up before noon. Anger flared, a reflex older than reason. He slammed the hood, cursed the sky, then stopped. For the first time, he caught himself mid-outburst and saw how ridiculous it looked. A man shouting at metal. He bowed his head, laughed once, and whispered, "All right, God, I get it." Strength, he realized, wasn't about controlling circumstances. It was about controlling himself. That lesson deepened when his mother's condition worsened. The doctors ordered stronger treatment, which drained her energy and his savings. The temptation to give up lurked at every turn, whispering that God had abandoned them. But each time doubt rose, Lucas remembered the verse from James. "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for the testing of your faith produces steadfastness." It didn't make sense in logic, but in his spirit it anchored him. He learned to pray differently, not for ease but for endurance, not for quick solutions but for quiet strength. He found that when his words ran out, silence became a prayer of its own, a form of surrender that spoke louder than pleading. During one of those silent nights, he sensed a phrase echo through him. "Be strong and courageous, for I am with you." It wasn't a promise that the road would soften, but that he would never walk it alone. Lucas began keeping a journal, recording not only victories but moments of weakness, the anger, fear, jealousy, and fatigue that visited like unwanted guests. Each confession chipped away at the illusion that strength meant perfection. True strength, he wrote, was the courage to face what was broken and bring it before God without shame. At work, his growing steadiness showed. Customers trusted him not because he was flawless, but because he was faithful. When storms knocked down fences, he repaired them even when payment was delayed. When younger workers slacked off, he trained them patiently instead of firing them. Strength, he saw, was not about dominance, but consistency, the quiet, stubborn refusal to quit when quitting was easiest. One evening, after dropping his mother at the hospital, Lucas stopped at a small park by the river. The water moved slow and dark under the bridge. Across the street, a group of teenagers laughed, taking turns doing pull-ups on a metal bar. Their arms strained, faces red, each one competing to outlast the other. Lucas smiled. Physical strength was admirable but fleeting. What mattered more was the kind of power that outlasted time, the kind that came from surrender, not superiority. As he stood there, a memory flashed. The winter formal, the laughter, the rejection. Back then he had vowed to become untouchable, to prove his worth. And in a sense he had, but now, looking back, he saw how hollow that pursuit had been. Without God, all his victories had been paper crowns. Strength divorced from humility was just pride in disguise. That night he wrote another journal entry. Lord, let me never mistake applause for power. Teach me to measure strength by obedience, not outcome. Weeks later, an unexpected challenge arrived. A large landscaping contract opened in a neighboring city, a chance to double his business overnight. But the project required him to work Sundays, missing church and the small group that had become his spiritual lifeline. The offer shimmered with promise. New trucks, bigger profits, and a future beyond scraping by. Yet something in his gut whispered caution. He spent 3 nights praying, weighing the cost. On the 4th morning, he declined the deal. His friends called him crazy. God helps those who help themselves, one said. Lucas simply smiled. He had learned that obedience sometimes looks like weakness to the world. A week later, a different opportunity surfaced, smaller in scale but steady and honest. It allowed him to keep his Sabbath and hire 2 men recently released from prison who were desperate for a second chance. Strength, it turned out, wasn't in expansion, but in integrity. By spring, his mother's scans showed improvement. The doctors couldn't explain it fully, but the treatments had slowed the disease. Lucas called it grace. One evening, she joined him on the porch, wrapped in a quilt, and said, "You've grown strong, son, but not the way I expected." He asked what she meant. "Strength isn't muscles or money," she replied. "It's what holds when everything else breaks." Her words stayed with him. He noticed how often the Bible spoke of strength in terms of dependence. "The Lord is my strength and my shield. Those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength." True power wasn't self-generated. It flowed from connection to the source. Summer brought light, and with it, another lesson. A severe storm swept through town, uprooting trees and flooding basements. Lucas and his crew spent 3 sleepless days clearing debris, delivering food, and repairing roofs. When exhaustion blurred his vision, he remembered the verse. "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Each time his body failed, something unseen carried him forward. In those weeks, Lucas learned that strength was both offensive and defensive, the courage to advance and the patience to endure. It was, as his pastor once said, the roar of a lion and the stillness of a lamb. The spiritual war was real, but victory didn't come through shouting at darkness. It came through carrying light. By the end of that summer, Lucas had reached the 2nd outpost of his climb. Humility had emptied him. Strength had filled him with grace, but the mountain ahead was steeper still. The next ascent would demand not only action but endurance, the rugged discipline to stand firm when life pushed back. The forge had made him strong, but strength alone wouldn't keep him standing. What he needed next was toughness, the unyielding resilience of a man who could be bent but not broken. Autumn returned with crimson leaves and colder winds, and with it came lessons that muscle and motivation couldn't solve. Toughness, Lucas discovered, wasn't born in the gym or the spotlight. It grew in quiet refusals. The refusal to quit when everything screamed stop, the refusal to trade integrity for comfort, and the refusal to let fear rewrite faith. Life's pace quickened again. His mother's recovery stabilized, but his business entered a rough season. A competitor undercut his rates, clients delayed payments, and a key employee left without notice, taking 2 others with him. Suddenly, the company that had once felt secure trembled like a house in a storm. Lucas spent sleepless nights calculating numbers, wondering if he should take out a loan or let the operation shrink. Panic wanted control, but a deeper voice whispered, "Be still." He knelt beside his bed and prayed not for rescue but for resilience. That night he remembered an old saying from his grandfather. "Steel is made strong in fire." Not comfort. He decided to face the hardship as training, God's forge for his soul. Toughness, he realized, had 2 sides. The first was self-control, mastering the impulses that led to ruin. The second was discipline, the choice to do what was right, even when it didn't feel rewarding. Those 2 pillars would either hold him steady or let him crumble. He started with self-control. When anger bubbled up at lazy workers or dishonest clients, he bit his tongue, counted to 10. and remembered Proverbs. A man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls. He saw how easily frustration could make him weak. Instead, he practiced silence, not passivity, but the strength to delay reaction until clarity returned. Temptation changed shape too. As his reputation grew again, admiration followed. Women noticed his confidence. Old classmates reappeared, curious and friendly. Lucas enjoyed the attention but feared its trap. He set boundaries, refused late-night messages, and reminded himself that desire without discipline destroys destinies. Paul's command echoed, "Flee from sexual immorality." It wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. Some wars were won by running. Discipline came next. Lucas rebuilt his routine around prayer, scripture, and physical work. Every dawn, he woke before the sun, read a psalm, and planned his day with intention. When fatigue whispered excuses, he worked anyway. When profit tempted him to cut corners, he held the line. The rhythm shaped him more than success ever had. In the quiet hours, he wrote new goals, not financial ones, but spiritual. To finish well. To love people better, to obey quickly, to forgive faster. He found that discipline was not a cage but a compass, pointing him toward purpose when emotions shifted like wind. Then came the storm that tested every lesson. One of his new hires, a man named Caleb, fresh out of prison, relapsed into old habits. Lucas discovered missing tools and cash from the register. Anger ignited instantly. For a moment, he wanted to call the police to let justice crush betrayal. But as he stared at the report form, a verse surfaced. "If your brother sins against you, forgive him not 7 times but 77. That night, he drove to the halfway house where Caleb was staying. The man looked smaller, shame heavy on his shoulders. Lucas handed him the form unsigned. "You owe me and you owe God," he said quietly. "If you want another chance, you'll earn it with work, not words." Tears welled in Caleb's eyes. It was the hardest forgiveness Lucas had ever given, but also the strongest. Mercy, he learned, was a form of toughness too. Weeks later, Caleb returned sober, steady, and deeply changed. He worked harder than anyone, and in time became Lucas's most trusted employee. Through him, Lucas saw how God's toughness wasn't cruelty. It was grace sharpened by truth. Toughness demanded more than emotional restraint. It called for resistance. When temptation or hardship knocked, Lucas practiced saying no, not once but repeatedly until no became natural. He resisted greed by giving, pride by confessing, despair by worship. Resistance was not glamorous, but it was power, a muscle that grew stronger with every repetition. Late one night after a long day of labor, Lucas stood on the porch with coffee in hand. The sky stretched endless, stars scattered like promises. He thought about the war Paul described, not of flesh and blood, but of spirit. Every man, he realized, fights it daily, against laziness, lust, anger, arrogance, fear. Toughness was the armor that kept faith alive amid fire. Still, one more test awaited him, the hardest yet. His mother's remission faltered. The doctors found new shadows on the scans. The hope they'd carried for years dimmed into uncertainty. Lucas didn't shout or break this time. He sat beside her hospital bed, holding her frail hand, whispering prayers between breaths. "If this is the next climb," he said softly, "then give me feet strong enough to follow." She smiled weakly. "You've already climbed further than you think." He stayed through the night, reading scripture aloud. "We are hard-pressed on every side but not crushed, perplexed but not in despair." The words became his heartbeat. When dawn came, he felt an odd peace. Not the peace of comfort, but of clarity. Toughness was not about winning. It was about enduring with faith intact. In the following months, he kept working, serving, and trusting. The business stabilized again. Caleb grew into a leader. His mother's health wavered but didn't collapse. And Lucas found a quiet joy. Not loud or flashy, but deep like an underground river. He had learned the paradox of faith, that the hardest seasons often yield the strongest roots. By winter, he knew he had reached the 3rd outpost on the mountain. Humility had broken his pride, strength had forged his courage, and toughness had sealed his endurance. Yet he sensed that the summit still lay beyond. What could be higher than surviving? What could be greater than standing firm? The answer came like a whisper in the wind that brushed through the bare trees. Self-sacrifice. If toughness was the art of holding on, self-sacrifice would be the grace of letting go. It would demand not only endurance, but surrender. A love so deep it would give itself away without asking for anything in return. And though he didn't yet know how, Lucas understood this much. The next ascent would require him to lay down everything he had built, his comfort, his plans, perhaps even his heart, and trust that the hands which had carried him so far would carry him further still. Winter arrived like a slow hymn, quiet and relentless. The valley slept under layers of snow, the trees naked, the fields pale as parchment. Lucas's life had steadied into a rhythm: work, care, prayer, sleep. But inside he sensed an approaching shift. Every other lesson had been about endurance or humility or strength. Now something deeper called to him, a kind of dying that was not despair but surrender. His mother's illness reached its final stage in early January. The doctors spoke gently but honestly. "We can keep her comfortable," they said, "but not forever." Lucas nodded, too tired to argue with fate. For months he had prayed for miracles, and perhaps they had already come. The extra time, the laughter that returned after chemo, the quiet nights when they watched snow fall through the window without needing words. Now his prayer changed again. "God, don't take her painlessly," he whispered. "Take her peacefully." In those weeks he learned what self-sacrifice truly meant. It wasn't about heroics or public gestures. It was in the small, invisible choices. Waking every 2 hours to check her breathing, smiling through exhaustion, refusing to complain when the bills mounted and sleep vanished. Each act of service chipped away another piece of self-centeredness until only love remained. He remembered the verse from Ephesians: "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." Lucas wasn't married, but he began to understand that the verse spoke to every man who would ever lead, protect, or care for another soul. Leadership was not about command, it was about crucifixion. Every day demanded that he nail another ambition to the cross of obedience. One icy morning, after settling his mother back into bed, Lucas went outside to split firewood. The air was so sharp it burned his lungs. Each swing of the axe echoed across the hollow. Between strikes he prayed in rhythm with the blows. "Let this work be worship. Let this pain be praise." When the pile was high, he leaned on the handle and looked toward the ridge where the sun would soon rise. He felt neither victorious nor broken, just surrendered. A week later, she passed in her sleep. The house was silent except for the hum of the heater. Lucas sat beside her bed until dawn, fingers clasped around her hand grown cool. He didn't shout at heaven. He simply whispered, "Thank you." Then, for the first time since childhood, he sang softly, an old hymn she loved. "It is well. It is well with my soul." The words wove through his grief like threads of gold, stitching sorrow into something sacred. The funeral drew half the town. People spoke of her kindness, her faith, her laughter that refused to fade even in pain. Lucas stood at the podium, hands trembling, and told them what she had taught him. "She showed me that love doesn't die when breath stops. It dies when we stop giving it away." The crowd was silent, and for a moment he felt the gentle pressure of unseen hands resting on his shoulders. Comfort, not from people, but from God himself. In the weeks that followed, Lucas found solace in service. He volunteered to fix roofs for elderly neighbors, cook dinners for widowers, and help the church repair its leaking baptistry. Every act of giving felt like exhaling grief. He understood now that self-sacrifice wasn't losing. It was returning everything to the one who had lent it. Spring came early that year. One Sunday, while helping rebuild a storm-damaged home, Lucas met Clara, a young nurse who volunteered with the same ministry. Her eyes carried the steady calm of someone who had walked through her own valleys. They talked about faith, about pain, about what it meant to serve without expecting reward. Clara said, "Love isn't something we fall into. It's something we choose over and over, even when it costs." Lucas smiled because he recognized the echo of his mother's lessons. Their friendship grew naturally. Letters, prayers, shared projects. Yet Lucas remained cautious. He didn't want to replace grief with romance. Instead, he let time test the roots. Through Clara's quiet strength, he glimpsed another layer of sacrifice. The willingness to trust again, to risk being hurt, to open his life instead of protecting it. That summer, his business flourished once more. He trained new crews, promoted Caleb to foreman, and used part of the profits to fund scholarships for youth from broken homes. When asked why, he said, "Because someone once believed in me before I believed in myself." He never mentioned names. The glory belonged elsewhere. In the stillness of each evening, he often walked to the ridge overlooking town. The air smelled of pine and distant rain. Sometimes Clara joined him. Sometimes he walked alone. He prayed for the men of his generation, for those drowning in distraction, chasing validation, mistaking arrogance for confidence. He prayed they would learn what he had learned, that the peak of manhood was not conquest but compassion. One evening, the sky burned with sunset fire. Lucas remembered every step of his mountain: humility, strength, toughness, and now self-sacrifice. Each stage had demanded a death, of pride, of comfort, of control, of self. Yet each death had birthed a new life. Standing there, he finally understood what Jesus meant when he said, "Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." He whispered, "I get it now." The wind moved through the pines like a choir. In that sacred quiet, Lucas felt peace, not the fragile peace of success or safety, but the enduring peace of surrender. He knew there would be other climbs ahead, other valleys, other crosses to bear, but the summit was clear now. It wasn't a place. It was a person. Jesus, the true man, had shown the way, humble before God, strong in spirit, tough in temptation, and utterly self-sacrificing in love. Lucas realized that the journey wasn't about becoming someone admired. It was about becoming someone surrendered. When the last light faded, he turned toward home. Tomorrow would bring new labor, new challenges. But tonight, the mountain was behind him and grace stretched endlessly ahead. He whispered once more into the dusk, "If strength is found in weakness, then let me stay weak. If victory is found in surrender, then let me never stop yielding." And somewhere beyond the clouds, the heavens seemed to answer with silence so full it could only mean yes. By late summer, the mountain that once towered before Lucas had become part of him. The climb had not ended at a peak of applause or prosperity, but in a place of stillness, a heart aligned with something eternal. The years of struggle had carved humility into his bones, strength into his spirit, toughness into his habits, and self-sacrifice into his soul. Yet the journey didn't conclude in solitude. True manhood, he now saw, wasn't proven on mountaintops. It was tested in the valleys where ordinary life waited. When he looked around, the world was changing again. The town where he had been rejected, rebuilt, and redeemed was growing, pulsing with new energy. His business had become a modest network employing dozens of people, fathers trying to provide, sons seeking direction, and even men who had once lost their way. Lucas no longer carried the need to be the best. He carried the responsibility to lift others. Leadership was no longer about being admired. It was about serving with scars still visible. He made a quiet rule for himself. Every hire would hear not just their duties, but his story, the mistakes, the lessons, the prayers whispered into darkness. Some days they listened in silence. Other days, they laughed at his younger self, the boy who once believed success would heal every wound. Lucas didn't mind. Laughter was a sign that they were listening. Clara stood by his side through those seasons of rebuilding. They married in the small church on the hill, beneath wooden rafters and sunlight streaming through stained glass. During the vows, Lucas's hands trembled, not from fear but from awe. When the pastor read, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church," he understood that the words were both blessing and burden. Love, he knew, was the daily art of surrender. It was choosing patience when silence felt safer, gentleness when pride wanted control, forgiveness before bitterness took root. Their first year of marriage wasn't easy. Business demands, late-night hospital calls from Clara's job, and the emptiness left by his mother's absence sometimes clashed like thunderclouds. But they learned to kneel before they argued, to pray, even when anger trembled in their voices. Lucas often whispered the same prayer, "Lord, make me a servant, even when I want to be a master." Each time, peace followed like dawn breaking through storm clouds. As months passed, he began mentoring younger men at church, some newly married, others fresh out of high school, all trying to define manhood in a world that mocked the very word. He never preached perfection. Instead, he told them about the mountain, how pride was heavy, how humility lightened the load, how strength without grace became violence, how toughness without mercy hardened the heart, and how self-sacrifice, at the hardest of all, was the only road that led to freedom. Manhood, he would say, isn't about what you conquer but what you carry, and who carries you. One evening, after a small group meeting, a young man named Aaron stayed behind. He was 19, restless, angry at his father, and terrified of failing. "I don't even know where to start," he confessed. Lucas smiled and handed him his old worn Bible. the same one he had underlined during sleepless nights years ago. "Start here," he said. "And remember, strength begins where pride ends." Aaron blinked back tears. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. Lucas replied, "Because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it." Driving home that night, Lucas thought about how far he had come from that trembling teenager outside the winter formal. He hadn't become the man he once imagined, rich, untouchable, worshipped. Instead, he had become something better, a reflection, however imperfect, of the man who gave everything for others. The more he gave away, the more whole he became. Years drifted gently by. His hair began to silver at the edges. The town kept growing, new generations rising with their own battles to fight. Sometimes he stood again on the ridge above the valley, watching the horizon blur into heaven's edge. The climb behind him was long, but he realized the journey of faith was circular, up, down, then up again, each season demanding new humility, new strength, new toughness, new surrender. One twilight, Clara joined him on the ridge, their hands intertwined. The sky flamed gold, the same color it had been the day he first whispered surrender. "Do you ever wish you'd done things differently?" she asked. Lucas smiled. "No," he said. "I just wish I'd trusted God sooner." They stood in silence as the last light faded, and he remembered every lesson that had shaped him. His mother's steadfast faith, Caleb's redemption, the laughter of his crew, the prayers whispered in weakness. Every failure had become a foothold, every heartbreak a rung on the ladder of grace. He thought about the words of Jesus, "Whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant." The world still chased glory, fame, and control. But the kingdom of God ran in reverse. The higher one climbed, the lower one bowed. Lucas had spent half his life climbing the wrong mountain before discovering the right one. Now he simply wanted to help others find the trail. As night gathered over the hills, he looked at Clara and whispered, "Do you think God's proud of us?" She smiled. "I think he's delighted, not because we did everything right, but because we kept walking." The crickets began their hymn and the valley shimmered under starlight. Lucas felt a quiet certainty settle over him. True manhood wasn't a destination to arrive at, but a daily decision to walk like Jesus, humble, strong, steadfast, and self-giving. He took one last look at the horizon and breathed a prayer. "Thank you, Father, for the climb, for the falls, for the grace that never ran out." And as he descended the path toward home, the wind moved through the trees behind him, whispering like an old friend, "Well done, my son." The mountain no longer loomed ahead. It lived within him, a sacred geography of humility, strength, toughness, and sacrificial love, proof that the true measure of a man is not how high he climbs, but how deeply he kneels.